Don't try any of what you see us do here at home.
We're what you call professionals. Welcome back to another episode of Screen Tested. I am your host Tyrant, and in today's episode we're going to be exploring the fire sword, or the flame sword. And no, this isn't deja vu, we have covered this before. I've actually done 2 episodes on this before. However, in both of those episodes, I used a one-handed sword. So in today's episode I want to do a two-handed one. Maybe that'll make it better. Maybe that'll fix all of the problems. I doubt it, but I want to try anyway. Now obviously the flame sword or the fire sword is from a whole bunch of different fantasy media. It's one of those really iconic and cool weapons. But in the real world, at least from the results that I've had, it's a little bit different. But I did want to make some crucial changes to the design of the sword for today's episode and testing to see if that can make it somewhat better. Because the more that I think about the fire sword, whether it's in fantasy or the real world, it just becomes more and more pointless. So, with all that out of the way, let's get started with today's episode. It should be a fun one. I mean, a fire sword is always fun, even if it's not particularly useful. The first thing I'm going to be doing is repurposing one of the fire swords that I tested previously. The pommel had broken off, and I decided this is the perfect time to extend the grip a little bit, give it a little bit more real estate, and turn it into something more like a hand and a half, rather than obviously a single-handed sword. So the first thing I'm going to do is remove all of the leather grips, the guard that it has on it, remove everything essentially, so we're starting from a clean slate with just the bare blade only. I'll then clean up the tang because it has a little bit of surface rust on it. The next thing I'm going to do is obviously find a way to put a pommel onto it. So I'm going to weld on a bolt so that we can thread a new pommel onto this sword. Speaking of the pommel and crossguard, I just picked out 2 that I really liked from my, my spare sword parts box. These ones are made out of brass. The first thing I'm going to do is throw the pommel onto the lathe and machine in a nice little groove. This is purely aesthetic and doesn't add any functionality at all. After that, I'm going to put a thread into the pommel so that it can screw to the tang of the sword. While I'm doing that, I also need to modify the crossguard very slightly because it doesn't quite fit to this blade, so I'll need to take down some of the sharp edges and corners so that it can slot nicely onto the blade. Now we're getting into the interesting modifications of the fire sword, and that is the wick. This is probably one of the most important parts. I've spent more time re-wicking the blades than actually using them. Like I said, I've tested a couple fire swords before, and the wicks would just burn out, they would burn off, they would break. So what I'm going to be doing is using Kevlar this time. This is a thin Kevlar rope. Specifically, I've got 3 strands of it, and I'm going to plait it. Is it plait it or braid it? I'm not sure what the terminology is. Whatever, I'm going to braid it together. This will hopefully allow it to absorb a lot more fuel to give us bigger fire, while also, because the Kevlar should be quite temperature resistant, so we should get a lot of lights out of it without it burning off and having to re-wick every time. But this should be a far better method for keeping a wick on the blade. So after spending an annoying amount of time plaiting the Kevlar rope, I'm then going to thread it through the blade all the way down and then back up again, and hopefully we should have a really strong and heat resistant wick now for the fire sword. Next thing I need to do is put the pommel and crossguard on. Now we get to the handle material. The original sword obviously had leather, and this worked out really good. It's a good heat resistant type of material, obviously when it's in thick quantities as well. I can't really glue anything to the blade because obviously it's just going to burn. So what I'm going to do is just cut off a nice long strip of this thick kangaroo hide. Then I'm going to double wrap it directly around the tang. So what this means is we have a nice thick comfortable handle that hopefully won't transfer any heat. I should mention that I'm actually quite surprised how comfortable the handle is, because obviously there's no wood in this, it's just wrapped leather, but because it's double wrapped, the thicknesses is really quite nice. I didn't intend for this sword to be this comfortable, but it turns out it's actually a nice sword, just in general. So let's start with the biggest and most obvious detriment of a fire or flame sword, and that is obviously that it ruins the temper and the heat treat on a blade. These are really critical in, actually making functional swords, and this fire removes those properties. So that's obviously hands down the biggest issue in the real world when it comes to one of these things. Next point, actually having a really visible blade, for example, if you want your sword to double up as something like a torch, sounds good in theory, but the problem is in practice, it means in like a dark confined space, you are the target. You're very easy to see. You have a big torch essentially. So if somebody was to attack you from the shadows, you really can't see them, but they can definitely see you. The next big detriment is obviously the re-wicking and the fueling. This does not last very long. It lasts maybe a minute tops. And obviously you have to carry around a big bottle of fuel all the time. Super impractical. Then we get to the next issue. Does this actually make it cut better as a sword? I really don't think so at all. Every single time I've used one of these fire swords, it honestly doesn't feel like it's cutting any better than a regular sword. It feels like how it cuts is purely just down to how sharp the sword is. It doesn't feel like the heat is doing anything at all. So what about as a big torch? Well, it does kind of put out a lot of light. The thing is, I think having a torch in your separate hand as a additional sort of weapon, like an offhand weapon, I think that's valid more so than this. Obviously, if you're carrying around something like this just for a light source, there is other alternatives that are way better. If you're enjoying today's episode, you should consider subscribing. It is free after all. So what about cauterizing the wound? That's something a lot of people might bring up, is that when it cuts, it cauterizes. Not really. In reality, it moves too quick through the target to actually cauterize the target. In fact, the biggest usefulness for this is actually cauterizing your own wounds. Why would you want to cauterize your enemy's wounds? If you're cutting them, you want them to bleed out. So with this, it's kind of the opposite. You might want to cauterize your own wounds. The next one is an important point, and that is obscuring your vision. In swordsmanship, you use your peripheral vision to be able to cover, somebody's full body when you're trying to parry an attack, etc. The flame actually does get in the way of your own peripheral vision a little bit and makes it hard to see your opponent's moves. Now, does it obscure your vision to a huge degree? Well, it depends kind of how much flame you've got in front of you, but it is a little bit of a distraction and it does obscure your vision ever so slightly, which is obviously not ideal when it comes to actually using a sword functionally. So is there actually any good redeeming qualities about a fire sword? In real life, not really. In fantasy, also, I don't actually think there's too much usefulness about it. It doesn't really enhance the sword in any tangible way. It doesn't make it cut better. Like a lightsaber is, I would say, a really good fire sword, right? So I just wanted to take a moment to expand upon this point, because even when I think about it in a fantasy context, I don't think it's very good. Even if we give it all the charitability of magic, it's not going to ruin the temper, you don't have to fuel it, you don't have to re-wick it, any of that sort of stuff. It can burn for as long as you want. I still don't think it's a good idea. The biggest detriment that I have with it is obviously it doesn't really increase the cutting capacity. It's far more important how sharp the actual steel blade is than the fire itself. And any sort of small benefit that I see when it comes to like a fire sword or flame sword, maybe like an enemy type, right? You're fighting a literal army of straw men. The problem is a regular torch could also be just as useful. So I think the fire sword is kind of useless even in a fantasy context. Now there is something like a lightsaber, I mentioned that earlier. That I feel like is the logical conclusion of a flame sword, but an actual useful one. But the biggest difference between something like a lightsaber and a standard fire sword is what actually does the cutting. On these, the steel blade does the cutting and then the fire is the enhancement. On a lightsaber, the heat of the blade does the cutting itself, which is far more preferable. So a lightsaber, I think, is a lot better than a fire sword, and I think a fire sword is kind of pointless. It's one of the coolest fantasy weapons that can exist, right? I think it is absolutely wicked. But honestly, it's really, really bad. In fantasy, in the real world, it's kind of terrible. So is there any sort of like context where I think this might be somewhat useful? And I do think that there is a specific context where it isn't wholly terrible. And that is as a morale boost. Imagine on the front lines, your king, your commander, has one of these things charging into battle, a beacon of hope, if you will. I think that is the best I'm gonna get out of a fire sword. Now, in terms of this long sword, this flame sword, fire sword, it was really awesome. It's way more comfortable. I think this is probably the best version that I've made so far, especially in testing. I think this is the closest we're gonna get to actually a functional fire sword. The Kevlar is still holding up incredibly well, so I'm quite happy with how this one turned out. I think we've just run into the limits of a fire sword. But that's going to be all for today, guys. I genuinely hope you enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts down below, what you think of fire swords, flame swords. Was this good enough as an attempt? Let me know down below. Have a good one, guys.